Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. My guest today is Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, former NATO Secretary General from 2004 till 2009. Mr. Scheffer is also the co-president of SDA, a Brussels-based think tank on defence and security policies. Mr. Scheffer, thank you for joining us from Brussels. Now, let's start with Iran, if you want. Over the weekend, Shimon Peres, the Israeli president, said that an attack on Iran was increasingly likely. As an expert on defence and security policies, I'd like to ask you, how do you regard this scenario?
Well, let me first say that I understand that for Israel, the developments in Iran, but let's wait first for the IAEA report, which is due to come out later this week. But for Israel, Iran and the enrichment of uranium and Iran developing a nuclear weapon is an existential question. So that President Peres and other Israeli politicians are extremely concerned and worried is to be fully understood. On the other side, of course, I hope that it is not yet too late. But many of this is in the hands of the Iranians to avoid a military confrontation and to see if a political solution can be found. But I have to admit that most of this is in the hands of the Iranians and certainly not in the hands of the Israelis.
But do you believe that logistically a strike could destroy Iran's alleged nuclear and military capacities?
Quite honestly, I don't think so. But I'm not the military expert here. But I remember that the former US Defense Secretary Bob Gates made remarks along the lines that a strike might perhaps postpone certain developments but would not prevent them. But let's not talk about military strikes yet, because I do think that diplomacy, even at this very late hour in the day on the Iranian dossier, should have its course. And I can imagine that in Washington and elsewhere, political leaders are scrambling to prevent worse things from happening. But first we have to see what the IAEA report will provide. But the indications apparently are, I haven't seen the report of course, that report might well contain some very disturbing and worrying information.
Let's move back to Libya. We know that at the end of last month, NATO officials celebrated the end of the mission in Libya. As a former NATO Secretary General, what lessons do you draw from NATO's intervention in Libya?
Well, first of all, I have to answer your question in saying that I think the NATO operation has been a great success. The United Nations Security Council resolution, NATO actions, it has been a great success. On the downside, I say that I would have hoped that more NATO allies, NATO as a whole, would have participated in this operation. So that NATO can stay the alliance it is supposed to be, and NATO does not develop into a coalition of the willing.
You're pointing the finger at Germany, I guess.
I'm not pointing the finger at any nation, because it was not only Germany. What I'm saying is that NATO is an alliance based on solidarity, and that we should prevent NATO developing and becoming an alliance where we see coalitions of the willing operate and other nations not operate. So in that regard, I think there's still work to do, but on the whole, I would qualify the NATO operation as a great success indeed, as my successor Anders Fogh Rasmussen has done.
Do you regret the fact that Mr. Gaddafi wasn't captured alive? And what is the role of NATO in this failure?
I would have preferred personally, but that is not as our world is, we all know. I would have preferred, of course, Gaddafi standing trial, either in Libya or facing the International Criminal Court in my native city, The Hague. It has not happened. We do not know exactly what happened. I have not seen a direct NATO role in the killing of Colonel Gaddafi. But I say again, we're not living, unfortunately, in an ideal world. Libya has now to rebuild itself without Gaddafi. Thank heavens, I say, without Gaddafi, without this dictator and this human rights violator. And I think it's now up to the Libyan people to decide what kind of nation they want to build for themselves. We can help them, but they are the ones in the driving seat.
And precisely, we know that recently the head of the National Transition Council declared that Islamic Sharia law would become the main source of legislation in the country. Is this the new face of modern Libya?
Well, let's wait and see. It goes without saying that whenever the Libyan government would call on Europe or other international organizations to help and assist in building a Libya where the rule of law prevails and where there's respect for human rights, the condition would be that human rights are respected. Now, you cannot say that Sharia as such is in contravention with what we consider, you and I consider human rights or universal human rights. But if things would get out of hand and we would see no respect for human rights or no rule of law, the international community would certainly say this to the Libyans and would not come to their assistance. I do hope that there will be freedom for everyone in Libya, that the rule of law will prevail, that Libya will be a nation where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be respected. That will be awfully difficult because there's no tradition in Libya, because Gaddafi had ruined everything. And where we can assist, we should assist, not NATO, by the way, but other international organizations. But I say again, it's up to the Libyans to decide.
Mr. Scheffer, very briefly, one last question on Libya. The mission was officially about protecting civilians, but many will say it was also about regime change.
Well, the result, I agree with you, the result was the regime change, but I do think that NATO has stayed within the limits, the boundaries of Security Council Resolution 1973. In doing that, and in doing what NATO did, of course, the then rebels on the ground, the now government, were able to oust this horrible man called Gaddafi.
Without the help of NATO on the ground? Without the help of NATO on the ground?
NATO as an alliance has not put any boots on the ground. What individual NATO nations have done is, of course, another matter. But the alliance as such, and that is relevant for NATO, because NATO had a Security Council mandate, and what individual nations do is another matter. NATO as such has not been active on the ground. As we all know, NATO has been active in the maritime domain and, of course, from the air.
Mr. Scheffer, let's talk about Syria as well. Do you think that a NATO intervention in Syria is imaginable?
It's out of the question. It is unimaginable. The conference you mentioned was also attended by a Russian speaker. It was crystal clear, as you know, that Russia, and the same goes for China, could not even agree, to my great regret and dismay, to a Security Council resolution speaking of sanctions against the horrible Assad regime in Syria. There will never be a Security Council resolution, and it is out of the question, as my successor Rasmussen has said very clearly and rightly and correctly, that you will not see and we will not see a NATO intervention in Syria.
Let's talk about Afghanistan. We know that NATO troops are due to leave Afghanistan by 2014. What guarantees do we have that the country won't be plunged into utter chaos?
We don't have absolute guarantee that stability will prevail. But what we should do and what we will do is, even after the military forces have left Afghanistan, that we stay fully committed. The moment has come, and when you talk to Afghans themselves, they agree with me. The moment has come that responsibility should now go into the hands of the Afghans. They owe their country. We do not own Afghanistan, neither NATO nor other members of the international community. But what we should do after 2014 as well, of course, is remain committed to Afghanistan by going on training the security forces, training the police,
and are you
giving them the assistance and the aid they need.
Are you confident that those security forces on the ground, the Afghan security forces, will be able to do the job and to fight an increasing Taliban insurgency?
Not yet, not as we speak, but huge progress has been made, and many NATO and other partner allies are at the moment engaged in training activities. This is, of course, nation building in Afghanistan is a matter for the long term. I mean, that nation was brought back to the Middle Ages by the horrible Taliban regime, at the beginning of this century. You can't change that overnight, not even in a decade. But as long as the international community stays committed, you will not avoid these horrible attacks by the Haqqani network or by the Taliban blowing up innocent Afghan civilians.
Very briefly, we've got less than 1 minute left. I know you've always been a supporter of a strong common European defence policy. This project has so far failed to materialise. Why is that?
It is to a large extent a lack of political will, a lack of coordination. People still regarding NATO and the EU as competitors, which is nonsense, because they are complementary. Libya has shown that the European Union should be in a position also to act under its own steam and under its own responsibility. Again, lack of political will, lack of coordination. Look at the lack of coordination where it concerns defence budget in the European Union. There's no coordination at all between the European Union defence ministers. The Americans have many other concerns and worries on their minds. Let me mention the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. The moment for Europe taking its defence identity seriously really has come. And if we don't grasp that moment now, it will pass. And that would be a great pity.
Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, former NATO Secretary General, thank you very much for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching this edition of The Interview on France 24. Please stay tuned for more news on our channel.